Welcome to the Ernie Chambers Show.
I'm Ernie Chambers, and I have a few things I'm going to share with you today. One difficulty for me is that I don't interact with people as I do on the floor of the legislature. And when I was on a program with Channel 2, Cox, people could call in. So now I'm talking through a microphone and to whoever out there might be listening or watching. There has been a lot of criticism of what has been called CRT, or critical race theory. There is a very tight race going on in Georgia and another one in one of those southern states, Virginia. They all kind of come together to me. President Obama is campaigning for the Democrat, and the lady who almost won the governorship in Georgia is campaigning because if the Republicans win one or both of those governorships, then it could be bad news for people who don't like what Trump was doing. It would be good news for the Ku Klux Klan, the right-wingers, the neo-Nazis, all of those who have always been in this country, but they had to kind of stay undercover because the racism was not as acceptable openly as it is now. Excuse me. It's getting just a bit chilly outside. But on that note, I've been telling people, whoever will listen, or whenever I'm around people and they're a captive audience, that they need to get that shot or multiples against COVID-19. It is out there, it is a killer, and it's harvesting people every day. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, as people say. And you can lead a fool to school, but you can't make him or her think. Periodically, they show families grieving for somebody who either is on a ventilator in a hospital and has been on one for days, weeks, and in some case months. And the family will be saying, anybody out there who hasn't been vaccinated, get the vaccination. But that is not going to persuade people who, for whatever reason, think they should not get vaccinated. It reminds me of the story of Noah, and whether it's true or not, in the sense of having been a historical fact, the lesson behind it is true. People will not take warning if that which is being warned against is not right in front of their eyes. So Noah told people that rain is going to come, everything's going to be flooded out, so you better prepare. People laughed at him. I don't know whether there had been rain before, but as always happens, when somebody sees things before other people, those who hear that individual think he or she must be crazy because they have not heard those things before. Well, you can, excuse me, you can never hear something before it's stated for the first time. So Noah built the ark. Then the story gets a little murky, unless there were only about 30 animals on the earth at that time. He was supposed to take 2 of every kind of animal, put these creatures on the ark. He and his family got on it. Then when the rain came and the floods came, then people began to knock on the door and ask Noah to take them aboard. And here's what it said, something like the 3 little pigs. Noah, Noah, let me come in. Noah said, not by the hair of my chinny chin chin. And according to the story, everybody drowned except Noah and his family. he sent out a raven and he sent out a dove to see if they would bring back indications that the water was receding enough for him to think about leaving the ark. This is the Noah syndrome now. There's a verse in the Bible, staying on that biblical course, that says if they won't believe Moses and the prophets, they will not believe the one returned from the dead. And I guess that was borne out. If you accept the story of Jesus's crucifixion and all the other things in the Bible as being factual, but say that they're not. He died based on the story, came back alive, and people still didn't believe. They say, oh, that was just one of those things that they made up. He didn't really die on the cross. They had somebody else who looked like him, and they hung him up there. And then they could get all this stuff, the funeral and everything, but they'd never let you see his face. Then they would let the real Jesus come out and people would say, wow, he came back alive. Those theorists, some people call them conspiracy theorists, others call them. I have confidence in what scientists say far more than I have confidence in somebody who's just talking off the top of his or her head because of something they heard on one of these nutty television programs. I got my vaccination, they call it a flu shot, yesterday. I don't get sick. The only time I was ever in a hospital was when I got a colonoscopy. I was not even born in a hospital. I was telling a doctor that I don't have to come to the hospital other than to visit other people. He said, that's wise. Stay out of the hospital and stay away from doctors. And he was a doctor. What he was saying is if you have good health, maintain it, retain it, and do the things that will make it possible for you to stay around here, for your friends, your family, even yourself. Maintain your health. When you lose it, it's gone for good. I started by mentioning the three letters, critical race theory, then talked about these two gubernatorial campaigns down south, tying it together. Those guys are talking against critical race theory. They don't think that the history of slavery ought to be taught. They don't think people in school ought to be shown that the economy of the United States was built on slavery, that the unpaid labor of Black people kidnapped in Africa, brought across the Atlantic Ocean, many of them thrown overboard to such an extent that sharks began to follow these ships. When white people put Black people in slavery, there are some today who say, well, there were slaves always throughout history. There were helots in Sparta. There were all manner of people when Rome ruled the world, and they were called slaves. But only in America was there the kind of inhumane, barbaric type of slavery where people were owned as property. There are people who are considered great philosophers who went to Rome and were held in other parts of the world as slaves, but they weren't clanking around in chains. They were not being beaten. Their women were not being raped. Their little children not being sold like livestock. America had a form of slavery like nothing that ever existed anywhere on the planet Earth. There are Black people and white people today who can be deceived because they will not read. They don't know history. They've been given a false message. They've been given mythology. I got tired of listening to all of this stuff, reading the trash that people would send to the World Herald. So I broke down and sent a brief essay, you can call it, and they published it. So I'm going to read it. The title that they put was History Lesson Shows the Need for CRT. And this was published September 11th, 911. Occasionally, a fortuitous revelatory confluence of events coming together presents an opportunity to foster enlightenment. The events are, number one, the raucous furor against, quote, CRT, critical race theory, and two, cash rewards proffered for tips leading to apprehension of human traffickers. Now, it's necessary in 2021 to be worried about human trafficking. And these white people want to say there was no such thing really as slavery of the kind that has been portrayed in the history books. They're teaching that which is false when they teach that slavery was a matter of people immigrating to this country voluntarily. And some teachers are saying that Black people came here as immigrants. Going on. Rather than undertake to enlighten by way of a point-by-point refutation of the yowlings of the anti-CRTers, their contemporary Luddites, and what were called flat earthers who thought the earth was flat and you'd fall off the edge, whose pernicious goal is expungement of embarrassing racist American history. I shall make my point via the amendment I proposed during the 2020 legislative session to LB 518, an anti-human trafficking bill. Why would it be necessary in 2020 to pass a bill outlawing the trafficking of human beings? Nobody said that these human beings being trafficked are beaten with whips, are made to work from sunup to sundown for no pay, beaten, treated worse than animals, none of that. But they saw a need in the legislature, and I supported it, to do away with human trafficking by way of advocating and providing harsh penalties. No human being can own another one in a moral or ethical sense. One human being can oppress, suppress, arrest, shackle, chain another human being, but there's no such thing as obtaining title or ownership. And that was done only in the United States of America, and Black people were deemed property and treated worse than they treated their property, other types of it. I had the amendment printed in the Legislative Journal for the record and discussed it in detail, but did not force a vote because I had no desire to hinder or delay passage of the bill. I could have stopped it like I can stop practically anything, but that was not my goal in offering the amendment. It was to put these ideas out there so they'd be there as long as there is a legislative journal. The amendment presents an undeniable, factual, sordid history lesson of the sort anti-CRTers would expunge if possible. The amendment states, given the subject matter and intent of this bill, it shall be considered within the context of the sordid history of America relative to human trafficking and sexual exploitation visited upon enslaved persons by slaveholders. If there is the kind of sexual exploitation now, are you going to accept the notion that these racist white devils are not going to sexually exploit these Black women, Black girls, little boys, and all those they sexually exploit today? at a time when they could be considered the owners of these human beings, like you'd own a cow, pig, or a chicken, but it was against the law to have sex with an animal. It was called bestiality. But the law allowed white people to sexually molest, torture Black women, men, and children any way they chose, and they chose to do it. They kept records of it. Thomas Jefferson, even in a writing that he did called Notes on Virginia, talked about this intercourse between slaves and slaveholders is so atrocious. And the things that happen, and I'm paraphrasing, the things that happen are so horrendous that our children see it and they imitate it. And that's the worst thing that could happen. These young white people had equated working with slavery and would not work. They were living in basements and attics with their families then because they wouldn't go to work because it was like slavery. And Thomas Jefferson, after talking about all of the wrongfulness of slavery and the harm it did to society, made the comment, "I tremble for my country when I remember that God is just." But he didn't tremble enough to free those slaves or to leave those Black women alone. And it's stated that when Miss Jefferson got tired of it, see, women didn't like their husbands going down into the cabins, finding these Black women more appealing than they, the white wives, were. Mrs. Jefferson, what do you have on your mind? She said, "Thomas, leave those Black women alone." He said, "Mrs. Jefferson, I'll leave you alone first." And they often did that. Same with George Washington and Martha Custis Washington. Washington had hundreds of slaves, hundreds of slaves. Let me continue. Can you understand why white people would not want these things taught? The things that their ancestors actually did were so horrendous that they don't even want it taught. And when we criticize it and complain about it, not only because of what happened then, but the carryover is with us to today. They say, "You ought to stop whining, that's over with." Well, if it's over with, let it be taught in the history classes. But these white people have not changed. Was every white person a slaveholder? No. Were there white people who objected to slaveholding? Yes. Were there white people who risked their lives to end slavery? Yes. But they were condemned. John Brown was one of them. John Brown. And he wound up being hanged when his raid on Harper's Ferry failed. But John Brown did not cry, he did not whine, nor did the Black men who were with him on that raid. They were in this big cart being trundled toward the place where they would be hanged. And not one of them whimpered. Not one of them cast his eyes down and looked as though he were ashamed or afraid. And they said that in the same way that Captain Brown and we attacked the arsenal, trying to win freedom for those who are enslaved. We did that as men, we'll die as men. And not one of them whimpered. And that took away from the ones hanging them some of the pleasure they wanted to derive from it. When you're twitching at the end of a rope, you cannot stop your body from twisting and jerking so they could get their sexual jollies from watching that. But they didn't get what they wanted before those men had the rope bite into their neck and cut off all of the ability to say or make any sound. These are the things that happened. I took my degree at Creighton in history, and I didn't limit my studies to what was taught in those classrooms and I didn't limit myself to the books that were considered textbooks. They're all written by white people from a white person's perspective. No matter how sympathetic one person may be toward another, without experiencing what that other experienced, the one writing about it does not write it from the understanding position of one who experienced it. And as a result, they interpret things that happen. But there were Black people who did learn how to read and learned how to write. One was David Walker, and he lived in Boston. He made his living as a tailor, and he wrote a book. They called it a pamphlet in those days, called Walker's Appeal. Some people call it One Continual Cry. And he recounted the history of slavery around the world, detailed and itemized what was going on in the United States right now. And you can get this book probably in the public library. Naturally, I have a copy. And when you read the facility he had with the English language, the way he put the words together, the way he wove a fabric of thoughts, an indictment and a condemnation of American slavery that was so devastating that the South was in an uproar, and they put a bounty on David Walker. $1,000 if you deliver him dead, $10,000 if you deliver him to us alive, so that they could torture and do the kind of things that those white people did and will do today. He died in his late 30s or early 40s, mysteriously. Some people say murder, others say it was not by murder, but that he died at his home. There's no way to know with certitude what story is true, but it is true that he did not live a long time. He was a fine physical specimen of the kind that the racists in the South would love to have enslaved, and that the white women would have taken pleasures with. Oh, you didn't realize that there were white women who were allowed to have sex with slaves? And you didn't know that when these white wives were having sex with Black slaves, their husbands were watching? You didn't know that? The British had a word for cuckolding, C-U-C-K-O-L-D or H-O-L-D. And it meant a man was being played on by his wife, but it came to mean a man who watched his wife play on him. And that's something that white men did and do. All of the kinds of sexual misconduct imaginable, and some not imaginable, because most people don't operate at that lower level, were indulged in by these white Christian so-called fathers of this country. The history that should be expunged is the false story of the American Revolution, as it's called. Thomas Jefferson as being one who believed in freedom for all people. I'm going to tell you all something that you probably will be hearing for the first time. Thomas Jefferson was not considered the father of liberty in this country because of what was written in the Declaration of Independence. Before that fine, soaring language, as they describe it, appeared in the Declaration of Independence, which Thomas Jefferson supposedly had written, the state of Virginia had declared independence and written a declaration. And if Thomas Jefferson didn't copy it word for word, he copied the sense of it. It wasn't original with him. And then he was a slaveholder. All of the hypocrisy that is in this country's history. So they had to fabricate what really happened. I, on occasion, have quoted a bit from the ride of Paul Revere. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. 'Twas the 18th of April, 75. Hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friends, if the British march by land or by sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light, one if by land, two if by sea, I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm to every Middlesex village and farm for the countrymen to be up and to arm. You didn't know an 84-year-old man could remember things, did you? More stuff that is not true. But at any rate, getting back to what I was intending to emphasize, Malcolm X said that of all subjects, history is the one best able to reward our efforts. And history is what we need to read, not the sham, the fiction that is in the classrooms and taught to these children to mislead them. And even the little that is there, these racists want to take out so that, as they say, young white people will learn how to love this country. It has so many warts, so many pustules, so many pus-infested, infected sores and scabs that it would make one sick to come face to face with it. But it's there. And people in the legislature wondered why I was so upset all of the time. But here is the difference between them and me, one of the differences. The Constitution is our only hope. It is not applied in the way it should, which means that we as citizens are entitled to every right and privilege bestowed by the Constitution and protected by the Constitution. There is no definition or even reference to second or third class citizenship. There are only citizens or non-citizens. Citizens are entitled to every right and privilege under the Constitution. But since we don't have those rights and privileges, obviously, we are not first-class citizens. When we learn their language, we can already outthink them. With our words, we can out-argue them. With me, when I first went down there, it was 48 against 1, and they could not cope with me. They would say how unfair I was, tying up the legislature in the way that I did, misusing the rules in the way they said I misused them. I said, they're your rules. I'm doing everything I do in accord with your rules. If I go outside the rules, somebody can call a point of order and the chair will put me in order. You know why you cannot call a point of order? Because I know the rules better than you do. You don't even know whether I'm in conformity with the rules, but you know, because of the way I conduct myself and the fact that some of those white senators who do know the rules cannot call a point of order on me, that I am operating under the rules. Since you all write the rules, you can write any rule you want to. And they tried, and I would call it always, and reporters would, and editorialists would. The Chambers rule, trying to stop me. And even when they would pass one, it wouldn't stop me. I can think, and they cannot. That's how I survived all of those years and ran the legislature. One reporter had said that there was a very wise woman who had said, the governor controls the purse strings of the state, but Senator Chambers sets the agenda for the legislature and the state. Am I boasting? I'm not acting, I'm facting. My record speaks for itself. There are reams and reams of articles and editorials that talk about the work that I did. Nobody had ever done that. It has been acknowledged. One editorial writer even said that when I left the legislature this time, the legislature would lose a brakeman, somebody who could keep that runaway train called the legislature from barreling through the rights of the people. And you know why I sought to uphold the Constitution? When I try to explain things, especially to white people, I use what are called metaphors, similes, analogies, where you say one thing is like another. There was a play written by a man named Robert Bolt about a Catholic named Thomas More, and he became the Chancellor of England. Getting ahead of the story, well, I won't do that. But in one of the scenes, there was a guy named Cromwell who did not like Thomas More, and he wanted to get rid of Thomas More. The king didn't like what Thomas More did or didn't do because the king wanted to marry a woman, and Thomas More said that that marriage could not be valid because it would violate the tenets of the Catholic religion. So people were trying to get Thomas to go along with it. He wouldn't. His faith meant a lot to him. There was a petition that was signed by all of the great men in England. Women didn't count. And Thomas had a friend who was a duke. And this duke asked him, "Sir Thomas, why won't you sign the petition?" And they had these 4 or 5 people at a table like this, religious people and big shot politicians. And Thomas More was standing before them. He said, "I will not sign the petition, and I will not tell you why I will not sign the petition." And the Duke said, "For God's sake, man." And the religious people cringed because that was taking God's name in vain, but maybe the Duke could get Thomas More to go along with the king's marriage and say that it's all right. He said, "Thomas, everybody has signed it. Why won't you?" And Thomas, he reminded me of myself. If everybody has signed it, why do you need my signature? And the Duke said, "Thomas, not only are you a righteous man, but you are seen to be a righteous man. Sign the petition." And Thomas More said, "I will not sign the petition." Then the Duke played his last card. He said, "Will you sign it for fellowship's sake?" And Thomas More looked at him. He said, "Let me put a question to you. When you and I stand before God's judgment seat, and judgment is to be pronounced upon us, and you are allowed to enter heaven because you did not violate your conscience, but I am consigned to hell because I violated my conscience. Would you go to hell with me for fellowship's sake?" And they knew then that he wasn't going to yield. Well, to get ahead of the story, he wound up having his head cut off. When time to cut his head off, he asked that somebody assist him going up the stairs because you had to go up on this platform so everybody could see you when you got your head cut off. He said, I need a little assistance to go up the stairs, but I will tend to coming down, meaning that when his head was gone, well, he didn't have to worry about how he got down. And when he was going to have his head cut off, he didn't have a mask. He wouldn't put on a mask. He wanted to see, and he wanted people to see him. And he gave the axe man a coin and told him, do your work and do it well. And when he laid his head on that block, he said, this has never betrayed the king. And he also made it clear that he would not betray his faith, even if to hold that position meant he would lose his head. And in fact, his head was cut off. His daughter, Margaret, claimed it and carried it around until I guess it turned into a skull. Strange things happened in England in those days. But before things reached this turn, Thomas More was at his house. And since he was an important man, he had a large house, a large entourage of people who worked. And there was a young man who was a spy for Cromwell. And he couldn't get anything on Thomas More, so he left. And they said, why did you let him go? He is a spy. And Thomas More said, yes, I let him go, and go he should, unless and until he violates the law. And the man said, well, he has violated God's law. And Thomas More said, then let God arrest him. And they were quiet for a minute. Then this young guy said, you would give that spy the benefit of law. Thomas More said, I would give every man the benefit of law until he violates it. This country of England is grown thick with laws from coast to coast. Would you? And then the guy said, would you give the devil the benefit of law? And Thomas More didn't answer right then. He said, would you cut down the laws of England to go after the devil? And he said, the young guy, I would cut down every law. And Thomas More said, and when you had cut down every law and the devil should stop and turn on you, what would there be that could protect you from the winds that would then blow? Yes, I would give the devil the benefit of law for my own safety's sake. That's why I have to speak for the Constitution, not because it does protect us. It is a mockery when it comes to us. But the Constitution is the only, as flimsy as it is, the only hope that we have. It's a hook on which we can hang our hat. We can still condemn them for not complying with their own Constitution. We can make appeals when we have the opportunity to those in other countries to condemn this country for its hypocrisy, while telling everybody else how they should give their citizens freedom to do this and that. The people who've been more loyal to this country than any white person have no freedom. There is no famous traitor who is Black. The famous Jewish traitor was Judas. The famous European traitor was Quisling. The famous white American traitor was Benedict Arnold. So the white traitor, the Jewish traitor, and the European traitor have given their names to those who are treacherous and would betray their own country. There is no black man whose name is in that number. But let me go ahead and read this. And I'm going to have to get a signal when I have about 10 minutes to go because I don't want to go over time. I get carried away. You want me to tell you why I get carried away? No matter how good my health is, the human body is going to wear out. And there's a verse in the Bible that says, my days are faster than a weaver's shuttle. Obviously, I'm closer to the end of the trail than I was even yesterday, even when I sat down here. I'm on the back porch of the years of my life. I wish I had more time left. However much time I have left, it's not enough for me based on what I would like to have. I'm not eager to leave this old sin-cursed world. I'm not ready to throw my hands up and quit. I'm not prepared to say that I was in public office for 50 years, 46 in the legislature, 4 on the learning community, which I helped create while I was in the legislature, 50 years of my life, more than half of my life. But I'm not ready to leave yet. There is a lot that needs to be done, which will always be the case. But there are things that I could do if I had the time. I've been approached by a publishing group to write a book. Some of you may have read a book called Just Mercy by a Black attorney who won a number of important Supreme Court cases. One of them said that a juvenile cannot be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Before the US Supreme Court took any action, I persuaded this old racist legislature to pass a law that said a juvenile or somebody who was under 18 at the time a crime was committed cannot be subject to the death penalty. Before that, they were. I persuaded them to pass another law before the US Supreme Court acted that said the term in those days was mental retardation. Nobody who is mentally retarded can be executed. Before that law, they could be. And in fact, 2 such persons were on death row. When I got the law enacted, both of them were taken off death row. I have literally pulled people from the jaws of death while I was in that legislature. But I didn't stop and say, I've got that done, now I'll sit back and rest. It just made me work harder, because if I can do that, what else can I do if I don't sit back and just let things take their course? I would be lying through my teeth if I said everything I set my hands to in the legislature turned out the way I wanted them to. More things didn't than did. I'll give the example that if I were, and this is one of those metaphors or analogies, if I were a hippopotamus and it comes to mandatory minimum sentences, death penalties, and so forth, if I were a hippopotamus, I could put all those in a basket and swallow them in one gulp. But I'm not a hippopotamus, and laws are not apples to be put in a basket. So I have to take one apple at a time and try to consume it one bite at the time. And in order to do that, you must never give up. You must trust your judgment. You must not rely on other people or let them determine and dictate what you are or what you're going to do. You should have developed an internal set of values from which you will not depart. And no matter what anybody says, what anybody does, what anybody threatens, you stay on course. And for all of those years, that's what guided me. It's why if I managed to get something done, I didn't rest on my laurels, as they say, and sit back. It spurred me to do even more, There will always be a lot that needs doing. The ministers are not going to do it. Politicians are not going to do it. Who will do it? That lonely voice crying in the wilderness, which will not be moved to the left or to the right by any whim or wind that is generated by critical people. They're not going to do anything. Their thoughts cannot hurt me. Their words cannot hurt me. So if every person would do what he or she finds it within his or her hands to do, a change could be brought about in this country. The Constitution, getting back to the point from which I started, can be a guidepost. And there are provisions in it that are bordering on the obscene. For example, and I've mentioned this before, there is only one thing that was mentioned in the Constitution itself that could not be amended by Congress, could not be amended by an amendment to the Constitution. The only thing that was put outside of the power of anybody to touch was the slave trade. For a definite period, the slave trade could not be touched. If we were immigrants, why did they call it trade? You trade in objects, not people. But we were considered property. You know where I was going when I started? I talked about David Walker and how he learned how to read and write. There was a statement among white people during the times of slavery that a Black man who learns to read is a good plow hand spoiled. When you read, you know that there's more to the world than this constricted place where you spend every waking hour of your life. There's more to it. There are people who have done things. They can inspire you. White people call it inflaming when we do it. When Thomas Jefferson, well, let me read this. I'm going to see if I can get a message. How much time do I have? I'm going to finish reading this because I started talking about the trafficking. The amendment presents an undeniable, factual, sordid history lesson of the sort anti-CRTers would expunge if possible. The amendment states, given the subject matter and intent of this bill, it shall be considered within the context of the sordid history of America relative to human trafficking and sexual exploitation visited upon enslaved persons by slaveholders. Therefore, it is appropriate to recognize and acknowledge some of the most renowned members of the All-American Pantheon and Register of Human Traffickers, which is hereby created. Charter members shall include President George Washington, President Thomas Jefferson, who's known for all men, are created equal, President James Madison, President Andrew Jackson, President James Monroe. I didn't want to give all of them because it would have taken too much time. Alexander Hamilton, who was the first Secretary of State. In this play, Hamilton, he was not a hero. He was a slaveholder. Let me find my place. Alexander Hamilton, Patrick Henry, Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death. Francis Scott Key, whose song included the words, and they now call it the national anthem, the land of the free and the home of the brave. All of these are slaveholders. John Hancock, who was a slave smuggler. And when they were signing the Declaration of Independence, not Thomas Jefferson, he always stays on my mind. John Hancock signed it first, and his signature is bigger than everybody else's. And when they mean signature, they use the term, give us your John Hancock. His family was very wealthy, and their wealth was built on slave smuggling. Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Roger Brooke Tawney, a Roman Catholic. A Roman Catholic, famous or infamous for that comment that Black men are so degraded and unfit to keep contact with white people. That's a paraphrase. Black men have no rights which a white man is bound to respect. That's in a Supreme Court decision. Continuing. Such a register should be kept, maintained, and prominently displayed in a location determined by the governor and accessible for public viewing. Additional names accompanied by factual documentation supporting placement on such a register may be submitted by any person to the governor for consideration. And the amendment provided for 3 persons on that committee: the governor, the secretary of state, and the attorney general. And you need to get 2 of those 3 votes to have another name placed. Due to his having owned hundreds of slaves, George Washington was invoked and claimed as one of their own by Southern secessionists to profit from his prestige, even as they sought to destroy the Union. I have a number of cases that I was going to present of the sexual assaults committed on women and children in modern times, this year, last year, by teachers, professors, law enforcement people, Catholic priests, all of the supposedly good people. And yet you're looking at me, one whom people have hung every insulting name on that they could think of. But none of them will stick. The cops could not frame me for anything. They would arrest me and falsely charge me, but they couldn't say that I had drugs. They couldn't say I drove drunk. They couldn't say I cussed them out, because everybody knew that those are not things that I did. I never ran and hid from anybody, and I never told anybody to do what I do what they believe they ought to do. When we had demonstrations during the 60s, I never encouraged anybody to throw a brick, to light a fire, or do anything was outside the law. And I would tell them, I can't get you out of trouble, so I'm not going to put you in it. Don't do anything that will give these people an excuse to lock you up. I advocated obedience to the law more than these white people did, and I was an example of it. They were not. I wanted to keep us safe, especially our children. I did not want to put any of them out there doing things that could shorten their lives or end their hope or chance to make anything of their lives by being arrested for some nonsensical stuff that some people encourage children to get into. All we can do is what we can do, but that we ought to do. I could say that I wish this or I wish that, but as they say, if wishes were horses, beggars would ride. And I say, if wishes were meat, then the poor would eat. So as that woman's song, I think she was Dusty Springfield. She was a Brit, wishing and hoping and singing and praying. That won't get it. None of that. And I used to tell them on the floor of the legislature that everything that is needed to be done to make this a fair and just society, where people would have access to the medical care they and their families need, decent, dignified employment, and a fair wage, the opportunity to obtain a meaningful education. Within our power as a legislature, we could provide all of those opportunities or provide the impetus to others, such as big shots with a lot of money, to do those kinds of things. And Nebraska, instead of being a horse in a buggy, would take off like a jet plane and be an example, not just for the United States, but for the world. So people would say that I was the most practical person in the legislature. I was the biggest dreamer in the legislature, that I was the man with the least amount of hope, but I was the man who would hope against hope. People like to provide labels and restrict a person into that label. I don't accept labels, because as soon as you accept one, you accept all the baggage that goes with it. People call me an atheist. I've never said I'm an atheist. First of all, the letter A, the word in front of something means you're against it or it doesn't exist. Atheist means you're against theism or belief in God. I said, I'm not going to be defined by a negative. I'm not going to be defined by what I'm not. And I can't stop people from labeling me, but I can reject the label. So I began searching. I knew there had to be some place, some words uttered by somebody, words that Americans, as simple-minded as they are, would understand. Americans think in slogans and they speak in cliches, no thought. And I found my mentor. He gave me my mantra. He is the greatest thinker / philosopher that America has ever produced throughout its history. That man is none other than Popeye the Sailor Man. The mantra, I am what I am, and that's all that I am. It's like saying, what is, what will be, will be. The subject and the predicate are one and the same. So I am what I am. Label me what you please, call me whatever you want, and it makes no difference to me. I will do what I believe I should do. I will say what I believe I should say, and you can like it or lump it. I look at compliments and criticisms the same way. Somebody said that compliments are like perfume. You sniff them, but you don't swallow them. You know, you smell perfume, but you don't swallow it. And when it comes to the name calling, I tell people that has as much impact on me as the sweat of a gnat would have on the Rock of Gibraltar. So don't waste time trying to put me down, because it's not going to work. Spend your time improving your mind. Get a goal and work for it. And don't let anybody or anything sway you from it or deter you. Don't give up and quit because people discourage you. What do their words mean? Nothing. A lot of times they forget them right after they say them. And you're going to go around upset because some fool said something foolish. You need to understand that nobody can compel you to think anything. Now, if you cannot withstand torture, they might can force words out of your mouth because of the pain, but they cannot make you accept what it is. They make you utter words as though you accept it. And with that, I don't want to overstay my welcome. And the good thing about this that I do, when you watch, you can just turn me off. I don't know if a single person is paying attention. I don't know if 10 people are paying attention, but I'm doing what I agreed with my daughter, my only daughter, that I would do. There was a poem written by Kipling, and it was called If. And he talked about if you can keep your, I won't go through all of it, I haven't got time. But he says at the end, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that is in it, and which is more, you'll be a man, my son. Next time I come on, I'm going to read that entire poem, but I'm going to change the last 4 lines. And if you're interested, you'll watch. Otherwise, just haven't got time for that. But at any rate, as the canary says, when he finds out that the door to the cage is open, I'm out of here.
Thank you for watching The Ernie Chambers Show. If you'd like to make suggestions, email us at ewcfacts@gmail.com. That's ewcfacts@gmail.com. This has been an EWC Communication production.